July 10th, 2026. 3 named Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders are confirmed dead, killed by United States Central Command strike operations inside Iran. Their names are in the public record now. Second Lieutenant Hussein Amuri, Lieutenant Sed Tavakul Zad, and Basij Commander Mosen Neji. Confirmed not by American military press releases. Confirmed by the Islamic Republic's own state media. When a government's own propaganda apparatus cannot conceal the deaths of its own officers, the message that sends about the scale and the precision of what is happening inside Iran right now is not subtle. This is not the story of a conflict that is winding down. This is the story of a conflict that is widening in every direction simultaneously, geographically, operationally, and strategically, while the world is still trying to process the opening moves. And then there is the detail that the mainstream coverage is almost entirely failing to connect. Iraqi Kurdish forces are mobilizing. The IRGC's own intelligence apparatus has assessed that a Kurdish ground offensive is being prepared along Iran's western border. Iran has deployed troops from the capital all the way to Cordon in the western part of the country and declared its armed forces at the highest state of alert, wartime conditions, formally. Iranian military planners are watching their western border, their northern supply corridors, their southern coastline, and their airspace simultaneously under sustained American bombardment, with Israeli air power preparing to join the campaign, and with 3 of their commanders dead before the morning briefing was finished. Let's back all the way up, because to understand the full operational picture as it stands on July 10th, 2026, the dead commanders, the Kurdish mobilization, the second rail bridge destroyed in Golestan province, the Iranian missiles hitting Bahrain and Jordan and Qatar, the CENTCOM strike packages rolling through 90 targets in a single announced operation, you need to understand the architecture of the strategic trap that was built over the past year, piece by piece, while the ceasefire negotiations played out in public and the real preparation happened in the spaces nobody was watching. For months, the dominant narrative in the analysis community was that the ceasefire was holding, that the pauses between conflict phases represented genuine de-escalation, that the negotiations were producing real progress, that the region was moving away from a full-scale confrontation. That narrative was wrong, not because the negotiations were dishonest theater, but because both sides were using the negotiation periods for the same purpose, to prepare for the next phase of the conflict more effectively than the other side was preparing. The ceasefire was a logistics interval. Both parties understood that. The difference was in how effectively each side used it. The United States used it to do something that the public analysis almost entirely missed. Washington gave Iran a temporary window to sell oil, a 60-day window, structured as a concession, framed as a goodwill gesture to create space for diplomacy. And here is what actually happened during that window. Almost nobody bought Iranian oil. The 60-day window was too short for the kind of long-term supply contracts that major buyers require before committing to Iranian crude. China bought a marginal amount. The rest of the market passed. Iran accumulated oil at sea, tankers loaded, floating, waiting for buyers who never arrived. The strategic purpose of that window had nothing to do with generating Iranian oil revenue. It had everything to do with demonstrating to the market that Iranian oil was not a reliable long-term supply option, while simultaneously allowing Iranian crude to pile up at sea in a form that could be seized the moment the next phase began. At the same time, the United States was doing 3 other things that only make sense as a coordinated strategic sequence when you see them together. Washington was actively working with Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman to deepen alternative logistics and energy infrastructure that would reduce the regional dependency on the Strait of Hormuz as a choke point. The Strait of Hormuz is Iran's most powerful economic leverage instrument. The ability to threaten or disrupt the passage of roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil creates strategic pressure that Iran has used for decades. The United States spent the ceasefire period systematically reducing the effectiveness of that instrument by building alternatives around it. Additionally, Washington strengthened domestic American energy security through production policy, reducing the price impact of a Hormuz disruption on American consumers and American allies. And finally, Washington waited for OPEC Plus output increases to add additional global supply, further reducing the marginal significance of Iranian production to global market stability. Read that combination carefully, because it means that by the time the current phase of the conflict began, the Strait of Hormuz was less strategically powerful as a leverage tool than it had been at any point in the previous decade. The oil that Iran was threatening to disrupt was less critical to global supply than Iranian planners had calculated. The buyers that Iran was counting on, primarily China, had been given time to diversify their own import options. And the floating oil stockpile that Iran had accumulated during the ceasefire window was positioned to be seized rather than sold. The ceasefire was not a peace process. It was a repositioning interval, and the United States used it with considerably more strategic sophistication than the public narrative gave Washington credit for. Now the current operational picture. As of July 10, 2026, the geographic footprint of the American strike campaign inside Iran has expanded fundamentally beyond its initial parameters. In the opening phase of this conflict cycle, American strikes were concentrated primarily on southern Iran, the coastline, the islands in the Persian Gulf, the IRGC naval infrastructure in the Gulf of Oman, and around the Strait of Hormuz. The logic was visible: degrade Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping and close the strait. The operational focus was on the maritime domain and the military infrastructure that directly enables maritime disruption. That focus has changed. American strike packages are now confirmed hitting targets in the northern parts of Iran, the eastern parts, and the western parts. IRGC military bases in Shiraz, strike operations in Bushehr province, not just the coastline, but mainland positions significantly inland. The airport in Kerman hit by American air power. American aircraft are flying over Iran with what the reporting describes as little effective resistance, prosecuting targets across the full geographic width and depth of the country rather than a targeted coastal strip. This geographic expansion is a strategic message as much as it is an operational choice. It tells Iranian commanders that the previous sanctuary logic, the assumption that the conflict would remain bounded to specific theaters or specific target categories, no longer applies. It tells IRGC installations across Iran that their location does not provide protection. It tells the Iranian command structure that the conflict has entered a phase where the distinction between coastal and mainland, between military and infrastructure, between symbolic and operational targeting, has been removed. And then there is the Golestan province operation. This is the one that needs to be understood with precision. In the northern province of Golestan, American forces struck a crucial railway bridge. This is the second railway bridge destroyed in the current conflict phase. The first was struck between Tehran and Karaj, used for military logistics by the IRGC rather than civilian transit. The Golestan Bridge is categorically different in its strategic significance. This bridge forms part of the railway line that connects the Islamic Republic of Iran to Russia and to China, the overland supply corridor that has been Iran's primary logistics artery for receiving external military hardware since the conflict began in earnest. The line opened approximately in 2013, and since 2025 it has been actively used to move Russian military cargo into Iran. Equipment, replacement components, strategic supplies, the hardware that keeps Iran's military posture functioning under the sustained burn rate that this conflict has imposed. Iran and Russia made a deliberate choice to use the railway rather than the Caspian Sea route. That choice was not arbitrary. It was driven by the recognition that the Caspian Sea was being actively monitored and targeted by American and Israeli forces hitting the IRGC Navy in the northern parts of the country, in addition to the Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman in the south. The railway was considered safer, more reliable, higher volume, the preferred channel for sustaining the supply relationship that Iran was counting on to outlast American military pressure. The Golestan Bridge strike eliminates that channel. For the second time in this conflict phase, the United States has successfully attacked the physical infrastructure of Iran's external supply relationship with its most important military partners. The first bridge disrupted domestic IRGC logistics between the capital and a key corridor. The second bridge severs the international supply line at the northern end, both gone. The Caspian Sea route, the alternative that Russia and Iran had already judged to be less reliable and more exposed, is now the only remaining overland option for Russian cargo movement into Iran, and its capacity limitations, combined with the targeting pressure on IRGC naval assets in the Caspian, mean that the effective resupply rate reaching Iranian military forces is now a fraction of what it was 48 hours ago. Now the 3 IRGC commanders. Their deaths deserve more analytical weight than the news cycle has given them. Second Lieutenant Hussein Amuri, Lieutenant Sed Tavakul Zad, Basij, Commander Mosen Neji. All 3 confirmed killed by CENTCOM strike operations in the Khuzestan province region, the southwestern part of Iran not far from the Persian Gulf, confirmed by Iranian state media. The fact that Islamic Republic state television is acknowledging these deaths rather than concealing them tells you something about the scale of the losses the IRGC has been absorbing. The losses are becoming too widespread and too well documented at the local level to suppress centrally. When the regime's own propaganda apparatus starts confirming officer deaths, it means the information is getting out through enough local channels that denial has become untenable. The Basij designation for Mosen Neji is particularly significant. The Basij resistance force is the IRGC's paramilitary mobilization arm, the organization responsible for internal security enforcement, for recruiting and organizing the irregular forces that serve as Iran's mass mobilization capacity, and for the ideological religious indoctrination infrastructure that sustains regime loyalty among the Iranian population. Killing a Basij commander is not just a military loss. It is a hit against the organizational structure that manages the IRGC's relationship with its own base of support. It degrades the indoctrination and enforcement architecture simultaneously. 3 confirmed officer deaths in a single reporting window. The pattern of who is being killed matters. These are not random casualties absorbed in defensive positions. These are commanders, people with names, with ranks, with organizational responsibilities. The United States is conducting a targeted decapitation campaign against IRGC leadership, and the confirmation of these deaths by Iranian state media suggests the rate of leadership attrition is accelerating beyond what the IRGC's internal security and concealment protocols can manage. But the detail that changes the strategic reading of this entire situation, the one that nobody in the mainstream conversation is connecting with sufficient weight, is the Kurdish mobilization on Iran's western border. The IRGC's own intelligence assessment is that Iraqi Kurdish forces are preparing a ground offensive into western Iran. Iranian forces have been deployed from the capital all the way to Cordon in response. The Iranian armed forces have formally moved to wartime conditions and the highest state of alert. This is Iran's own declared assessment of its own vulnerability on its own western border. That declaration carries more analytical credibility than any external assessment, because it reflects what Iran's intelligence services are actually seeing on the ground and what Iranian military planners genuinely believe is coming. To understand what a Kurdish ground offensive would mean, you need to understand the geography and the internal fragmentation of the Kurdish political situation across the region. Because it is not simple, and the simplification of it leads to completely wrong conclusions about what is actually at stake on Iran's western border. There are multiple distinct Kurdish political communities in the region, and they do not share the same objectives. Iranian Kurds, those living inside the Kurdistan province of Iran, have historically sought recognition, cultural preservation, and political rights within an Iranian national framework. Many of them identify as Iranians who are also Kurdish. Their political aspirations have been oriented toward a reformed and free Iran, not toward separation. Their loyalty structure is to Iran as a country, not to the Islamic Republic as a regime, a distinction that becomes critically important as the regime itself comes under existential military pressure. Iraqi Kurds, the population based primarily in Erbil in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, have a categorically different political orientation. Their objective is the realization of an independent Kurdish state, carved out of territory currently distributed across Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. The portion of Iranian territory they would claim as part of that independent Kurdistan includes the western provinces of Iran, where Iranian Kurds live, which creates an immediate and irreconcilable conflict between the territorial aspirations of Iraqi Kurdish separatists and the political identity of Iranian Kurds who consider themselves Iranian. This distinction is why the prospect of an Iraqi Kurdish ground offensive into western Iran carries a complexity that the headline framing of Kurds invade Iran entirely misses. An Iraqi Kurdish ground move into Iranian territory would not be received uniformly by the Kurdish population it crosses into. Iranian Kurds who support a free Iran, who want regime change in Tehran without territorial dismemberment of the Iranian nation, may not welcome an externally driven territorial grab regardless of shared ethnicity. The political fracture lines within the Kurdish world are real, and they complicate any simple narrative about Kurdish solidarity against the Iranian regime. Then there are Syrian Kurds, a third distinct political community whose primary aspiration has been recognition as Syrian citizens within a reformed Syrian state, which the post-Assad Syrian government has at least partially committed to addressing. And Turkish Kurds, a fourth community that has existed in a state of violent suppression under Ankara for decades, with a completely different set of political relationships and constraints. The IRGC's paranoia about the western border predates the current conflict phase. Iranian forces have been conducting preemptive strikes against Kurdish positions in Erbil in Iraq for months, not because an offensive was confirmed imminent, but because the IRGC assessed the Kurdish mobilization posture as a persistent and growing threat that required preemptive pressure to suppress. The fact that the IRGC is now formally deploying troops from the capital westward and declaring wartime alert conditions suggests the intelligence picture has moved from persistent concern to acute alarm. What a successful Kurdish ground offensive into western Iran would do to the IRGC's operational position is not difficult to analyze. Iran is already managing simultaneous pressure along its entire southern coastline, across multiple northern provinces, hit by American strikes on its eastern and central infrastructure and in the strategic logistics corridors connecting it to Russia and China, adding an active ground defense requirement on the western border against a force operating with terrain familiarity and potentially with external intelligence and logistical support would stretch Iranian military deployment capacity beyond what its current force posture can sustain without pulling resources from one of the existing defensive axes. The IRGC knows this. That is why the declaration of wartime alert conditions in the West is not bureaucratic procedure. It is genuine alarm about the possibility of a second ground front opening, while the aerial front is already consuming resources and producing casualties at a rate the system is struggling to manage. Now the scale of the American strike campaign in hard numbers, because the numbers from CENTCOM's own statements are significant enough to require full accounting. United States forces struck approximately 90 Iranian military targets in the announced operational package: air defense systems, coastal surveillance assets, missile and drone storage sites, naval capabilities, and military logistics infrastructure along Iran's coastline. That is 90 targets in a single announced operational package. In addition, American forces struck 80 more Iranian military targets in a separate operation, including more than 60 IRGC small boats and additional targets in mainland Iran away from the coastline. The operations in the current conflict phase are being led by Admiral Brad Cooper of U.S. Central Command. Count those numbers together: 90 targets, 80 additional targets, 60-plus small boats, 2 destroyed rail bridges, 3 confirmed dead commanders, strike packages confirmed over Shiraz, Kerman, Bushehr province, and Golestan province simultaneously. Power outages across Golestan province in southern Iran from power plant, strikes delivered on the timeline that American leadership had publicly stated they would deliver. This is not the operational tempo of a limited punitive campaign. This is the operational tempo of a sustained, multi-theater, multi-axis degradation campaign that is systematically working through Iran's military capability in every domain simultaneously. And Iran is retaliating. The picture of Iran's retaliatory posture is itself analytically revealing, because the pattern of who Iran is hitting, and critically, who Iran is conspicuously not hitting, tells you more about the actual state of Iranian military capability and strategic confidence than any statement from Tehran. Iran has launched missiles and drones at Jordan, at Bahrain, at Kuwait, at Qatar, and at Iraq. 2 Iranian ballistic missiles successfully struck the United States Forces headquarters in Bahrain, a confirmed impact documented on video. The Bahrain strike is the most consequential confirmed Iranian hit on an American-linked military installation, and it demonstrates that Iran retains the capability to penetrate the air defense coverage of at least some of the countries it is targeting. The Qatar strikes are politically remarkable in a different way. Qatar and Iran have maintained a complicated but functional relationship. Qatar's geographic position in the Persian Gulf and its hosting of significant American military infrastructure has made it a careful neutral actor in previous regional conflicts. Iran striking Qatari territory is not a sign of strategic confidence. It is a sign of the political and strategic desperation that comes from operating under existential military pressure. Iran is not hitting Qatar because Qatar represents a military threat. Iran is hitting Qatar because the IRGC needs to demonstrate reach and impact across the region while it is absorbing devastating losses from American strikes. And Qatar is a reachable target that generates political pressure without triggering the specific escalation that Iran is clearly and deliberately trying to avoid triggering. Because there is one country that Iran has conspicuously not hit: Israel. The IDF has not been the target of Iranian ballistic missiles or drone strikes in the current conflict phase, despite Iran's repeated public declarations that it is at war with Israel as much as with the United States. Iran has been saying for months, publicly, loudly, repeatedly, that the moment for striking Israel is coming, and the missiles that have flown toward Jordan, toward Bahrain, toward Qatar, have not flown toward Tel Aviv, or Haifa, or Ben Gurion Airport. The reason is not difficult to identify. The IRGC's military planners understand something that its political spokespeople cannot admit publicly. The moment Iran launches a significant direct strike on Israeli territory, the Israel Defense Forces enter this conflict as an active combatant at full operational tempo. The IDF has been on high alert throughout this conflict phase, monitoring the situation in both Iran and Lebanon simultaneously. The IDF chief has now publicly confirmed that the campaign and war in Iran is not over, that new military plans are already on the drawing board, and that major military operations are expected to begin soon. The Israelis are coming. The timeline is a function of planning completion, not of political decision-making. The political decision has already been made. The previous rounds of this conflict established the pattern. In June 2025, Israel initiated the first phase, and the Americans joined. In February 2026, both moved simultaneously. In the current phase, the Americans initiated, and the Israelis will join once their operational preparation is complete. The sequence is consistent. The outcome of adding Israeli air power and strike capability to a campaign that is already producing the damage that CENTCOM's announced numbers reflect is not difficult to project. Iran knows this. The decision not to strike Israel directly is not restraint born of principle. It is restraint born of the assessment that the IRGC is not yet in a position to absorb an IDF military response on top of everything else it is already absorbing. The ceasefire extensions, the negotiations, the pauses. In significant part, they were Iran buying time to get to a position where it could take on the IDF simultaneously with the American campaign. The fact that Iran has not struck Israel after months of rhetoric, declaring the intention to do so, tells you the IRGC's own internal assessment. They are not there yet. They are not ready. which makes the IDF's announced imminent return to active participation in this campaign strategically decisive. Because if the IDF enters before the IRGC reaches the state of readiness it has been preparing for, Iran absorbs a massive new pressure vector at the exact moment when its commanders are being eliminated, its supply lines are severed, and its western border is under threat from Kurdish forces. The Iranian response to all of this at the political level has been precisely what you would expect from a government that is taking catastrophic military and strategic losses while being constitutionally unable to admit it publicly. The Speaker of Parliament declared that America still has not learned that bullying and breaking promises are no longer cost-free, and that if America strikes, it will be struck in return. This is the statement of a political institution under enormous pressure to produce defiant language for a domestic audience that is living through power outages caused by American strikes on power infrastructure, without the ability to know how many IRGC commanders have been killed or how many rail bridges have been destroyed. The Parliament Speaker's statement is calibrated for internal consumption. It is not a strategic assessment. It is political survival language. More alarming than the parliamentary statement was the footage broadcast on Iranian state television showing an official swearing an oath to personally assassinate President Trump. This is a government broadcasting assassination pledges on national television. This is not controlled political messaging. This is a sign of a system under so much internal pressure that normal information management protocols are breaking down, that the institutional impulse to demonstrate defiance is overriding the strategic calculation of what broadcasting assassination threats against a sitting American president does to the international political environment around the conflict. Now let's go inside the IRGC command structure. Because understanding who is actually making decisions and under what conditions those decisions are being made is essential to projecting where this goes in the next 48 to 72 hours. The IRGC's nominal chain of command flows upward through a defined hierarchy to the supreme leader. But the operational reality of how the IRGC functions, particularly under the kind of sustained decapitation pressure that the American campaign is now applying, is considerably more complex than the organizational chart suggests. The IRGC is not a conventional military hierarchy where orders flow cleanly from top to bottom and information flows cleanly from bottom to top. It is a parallel power structure with multiple institutional factions, competing commanders, and significant autonomy at the operational level that has been cultivated deliberately over decades as a hedge against exactly the kind of external attack that is happening right now. When you kill 3 commanders in Khuzestan province in a single operational window and confirm their deaths through state media, you have done more than eliminate 3 individuals. You have sent a signal through every level of the IRGC command structure that the American targeting intelligence is accurate, that hiding in standard military positions does not provide protection, and that the American strike campaign is capable of finding and eliminating specific named individuals. The psychological effect of that demonstration on the surviving IRGC command structure, on the officers who are now calculating their own personal survival, alongside their military responsibilities, is not captured in casualty statistics. The Basij commander among the dead matters, particularly because the Basij organizational structure is Iran's mass mobilization and internal control mechanism. It is the layer between the IRGC's professional military apparatus and the Iranian civilian population. Degrading Basij command capacity does not just weaken Iran militarily. It weakens the regime's capacity to manage internal dissent as the population absorbs the consequences of the conflict, the power outages, the economic disruption, the news of military losses that can no longer be fully suppressed. The Supreme Leader's ability to maintain effective control over this situation depends on the IRGC functioning as a coherent, discipline-following institution. As commanders are killed, as communications infrastructure is hit, as the organizational coherence of individual IRGC elements degrades under sustained bombardment, the gap between central command intent and field-level action widens. This is not a theoretical risk. This is the operational reality of any military organization that is absorbing rapid leadership attrition across multiple theaters simultaneously. The honest strategic assessment of where this stands on July 10, 2026 is this. Iran is losing the military exchange at every level. Its commanders are being systematically eliminated. Its supply corridors are being physically destroyed. 2 rail bridges gone, the Caspian Sea route under pressure, the air delivery option operationally infeasible. Its air defense systems are being degraded by the same strike packages that are hitting everything else. Its power infrastructure in multiple provinces is offline. Its retaliation against countries in the region demonstrates reach, but not decisiveness. 2 missiles hit the U.S. headquarters in Bahrain, which is a real operational achievement, but it is not an achievement that changes the fundamental strategic balance. The IRGC is absorbing losses at a rate that its resupply and reconstitution capacity cannot match, and the resupply capacity is getting worse, not better, as the rail corridors fall. But the assessment cannot stop there, because operational military disadvantage does not translate automatically into conflict termination in a system like the Islamic Republic. The IRGC's institutional identity is built on the narrative that it endures and prevails against overwhelming external pressure. The regime's domestic legitimacy rests on the same narrative. Accepting defeat, accepting the terms that would end the conflict on American and Israeli terms, is existentially threatening to the regime in a way that military losses, however severe, are not by themselves. This creates the most dangerous dynamic in this conflict. A regime that cannot afford to admit it is losing, operating a military institution under sustained decapitation, with a new ground threat emerging on its western border, and with the IDF preparing to enter the campaign. The decision-making pressure inside that system, the institutional forces that drive toward escalation as a demonstration of survival, rather than toward negotiation as an acknowledgement of reality, does not diminish as the military situation deteriorates. It intensifies. The structural risk is this: the IRGC is losing commanders. When you lose commanders in a hierarchical military organization under combat pressure, the surviving members of that organization make decisions under conditions of incomplete information, disrupted communications, personal fear, and institutional pressure to demonstrate that the organization is still fighting. The risk of an escalatory action taken by a surviving IRGC commander, one that bypasses the normal authorization chain, one that crosses a threshold that triggers a response from the United States or Israel of a categorically different scale from the current campaign, increases as the leadership structure degrades. The assassination threat broadcast on Iranian state television, the kill list that has been publicly confirmed to contain American leadership at the top. These are not background noise. They are operational signals from an institution under existential pressure, signaling in the only language it knows how to signal in, the language of threatened violence, because the alternative language, the language of negotiation and strategic realism, is not available to it politically. The Kurdish ground offensive, if it materializes, adds a second ground front to an aerial conflict that is already consuming Iran's military capacity faster than it can be replaced. The IDF's imminent entry into the campaign adds a third major military actor to a bilateral engagement that was already going badly for Tehran. The economic pressure from potential oil tanker seizures, from the destroyed rail corridors, from the degraded Strait of Hormuz leverage, is compressing the financial architecture that funds the military posture from below, while the military posture is being degraded from above. All three tracks, military, financial, psychological, are converging simultaneously on the same point: the Iranian command structure's ability to function coherently, make centralized decisions, and sustain a credible military response. On July 10th, 2026, the morning after Second Lieutenant Hussein Amuri, Lieutenant Sed Tavakul Zad, and Basij Commander Mosen Neji were confirmed dead in Khuzestan province, the strategic picture is not moving toward equilibrium. It is moving toward a threshold, one that is approached from the Iranian side by escalating desperation, and from the American and Israeli side by escalating operational tempo. The Golestan railway bridge is in pieces. The power is out in the northern provinces. CENTCOM has struck 90 targets in one announced package and 80 in another. The Kurds are moving. The IDF is planning. The Speaker of the Iranian parliament is giving speeches about cost-free bullying to a domestic audience that cannot see the full extent of what is happening to their military. And the three commanders who forgot to go into hiding, whose names are now part of the public record, confirmed by the regime they served, are the most visible symbols of a campaign that is not looking for symbols. It is looking for results, and it is finding them, one strike package at a time, across every province of a country that is running out of options faster than it is running out of missiles. The next 48 to 72 hours will not look like the previous 48 to 72. The IDF's entry into the campaign changes the operational geometry entirely. The Kurdish question on the western border remains unresolved in ways that could accelerate or complicate on very short notice. The economic pressure is building toward a breaking point that Iran cannot manage its way around. And somewhere in Khuzestan province, the spaces where three commanders used to sit are now empty, and the people above them are calculating in real time how long they can absorb this before the calculation changes into something that no analysis produced before this morning fully accounted for. The war is not ending. The war is expanding. And the names carved into the public record today, Hussein Amuri, Sed Tavakul Zad, Mosen Neji, are not the last names that will be added to this list before the list stops growing.